are all sorts of new forms of church which are popping up all over the place in our culture. That church is no longer just 10:30 on a Sunday morning in a medieval building. It can be assembling by text message on your motorbikes in the middle of a town. It can be messy church. It can be in a small group. It can be in a nightclub. Church is taking all sorts of forms, like water poured into lots of different shaped and sized containers. And one of the new forms of church is what's called new monasticism. People looking back at how monks would organise their lives and how nuns would organise their lives, a rule of life, a common pattern of prayer and work and living, and seeing if that's a way of being a Christian community and expressing the life of Jesus together. A man called George Lings has done loads and loads of research into these different new forms of church and wrote a book a few years ago about the new monastic movement and how it connected with the ancient ways of monasteries. The book's called 7 Sacred Spaces. And he talks about the spaces that were built within the monasteries because monasticism pushed forward architecture and in the architectural challenges that it gave to people, along with so many other areas where it helped the cultural life of Europe develop. And monasteries would have all sorts of different spaces within them. Many would have a brewery because they needed to create wine for communion. Often there'd be a hospital for looking after the sick. But Lings found in both new and old monasteries and convents, again and again, the same 7 spaces. And so he writes a book about 7 sacred spaces that express the life of a monastery and wonders whether they could form a pattern for expressing the life of a local church in local community in our day and age. So the 7 spaces are the chapel, where the monks would gather for prayer, often up to 9 times a day, to chant and sing the psalms together, to hear scripture read, and to pray together, because prayer was at the heart of their life. That was the chapel. There was also the cell for private prayer. Each monk would have their own place to go, to be alone with God, to pray, to study, to just get down on their knees and work through what was in their hearts and deepen their walk with Jesus. And the cell, individual prayer, complemented the chapel, corporate prayer and worship. The monastery also had a number of other spaces. One would be the library, or the scriptorium. That was where the books and scrolls and artwork were collected, where monks would copy them out, because prior to printing, that was the only way of duplicating learning and books, and the only way of passing on knowledge. As the copying out became more and more elaborate, you found artwork and creativity happening in the scriptorium in the library as well. So the library was a place where learning was preserved, where it was passed on, and where it was treasured. And often monks would have schools to raise up the next generation of monks, teaching young boys to read and write so that they too could receive this learning and then pass it on to the next generation. So you have the chapel, a place of worship, the cell, a place of prayer, the library, a place of learning. There's also the refectory, at the heart of the monastery, the place where people ate and where travellers and visitors could be received. The refectory was a place of hospitality, where everyone could sit down as equals and eat together and enjoy that fundamental thing in the Christian faith of eating, of breaking bread, of sharing around a table. A 5th space within the monastery was the garden. That was a place of work and of service. Every monk would have to do manual work as part of their daily rhythm. And so the garden, where food was grown, both for the monks and to feed the poor in the community, was a place of work. And it was a place of service, where work was done for the benefit of other people, not just for yourself. And work itself was seen as a good thing. It was seen as spiritually formative, that the discipline of work, of clearing marshland and turning it into agricultural land, both reclaimed creation and did something to you, the worker, to give you all sorts of virtues that you wouldn't have got otherwise, of endurance, of persevering through pain, of steadfastness, of service, and so on. So the garden, a place of work, alongside the refectory, a place of hospitality, and the scriptorium, a place of learning. The final 2, the chapter house. Many monasteries would have a place where the whole community could meet together And the chapter house was usually circular or hexagonal, so everybody could meet as equals and everybody could hear one another. And in the Rule of St. Benedict, which was the main monastic ordering document, Benedict insisted that in any decision made by the community, it should be the youngest monks who got the chance to speak first. The chapter was where the community met to talk through issues, to discuss things, and to make decisions about their common life. We see the early church doing this at the start of Acts. They have to select a new apostle to take the place of Judas. Partway through Acts, there's a discussion about how the mission to non-Jewish people should go forward. And so making decisions about their life together was an important part of monastic life, and the chapter house was the space that embodied that. And the final space that Lings talks about is the cloister. The cloister were the covered corridors. You'll see loads in Wells Cathedral and any other monastery you choose to go to. They were the connecting spaces between everywhere else, and the cloister might be where you sat and read. It might be where you went for a walk with somebody and had a conversation. It might be where you bumped into the person that you've been trying to avoid for weeks. The cloister is a place of availability, the place of the unstructured meeting, the place of just wandering around, bimbling around, and just being there and being available, and finding that you were walking with somebody else, and perhaps, as you did so, walking with Jesus. So you have 7 spaces: the chapel, the cell, the library, the refectory, the garden, the chapter house, and the cloister. And each of those spaces embodies a different value. The chapel embodies worship, the cell for prayer, the library for learning, the refectory for hospitality, the chapter house for decision making, the garden for work and service, and the cloister for availability. Now, what would it be like to have a church that operated on those 5 principles, where it wasn't just about worship, which is what most of our church buildings embody? I mean, you can find bits of the other spaces around. A church might have a bookstall, that's our version of the library. Or there'll be a kitchen where we can serve tea and coffee in. We've got a refectory. There might be a churchyard or some grounds that some people look after and other people enjoy. So we've kind of got a bit of a garden. And often if a church is open through the day so people can come and sit and be, that there's a sense of availability there as well. But often our churches were built on the edge of communities. They weren't built to be the heart of a community the way a monastery was. But what would happen if we had a church where it wasn't simply about the worship space, which is the main space in most of our church buildings, but if actually the church, in either the way it was built or the way it lived, tried to embody all 7 of those values? We've been looking at St. Peter's, about whether having the church and the community centre all in a single place, in a community that needs so much love and care, that might reflect something of those 7 sacred spaces. So St. Peter's Church itself, which will be open when the centre is open, it's a place of worship, and we can also have prayer stations and resources there for people to engage in private prayer. There's the cafe, kitchen, central area for hospitality. There'll be all sorts of people providing education and learning for adults and children, including a pop-up library from Somerset Library. So there's the learning and the passing on of learning. There'll be garden space around the centre and the opportunity to volunteer and to serve, so it embodies those values of work and service as well. It'll be where both the management committee for the centre and the community association and the church are based and can make decisions about their life and the life of the community. So it brings people together to say, what do we want our life to be like? How do we want to see things develop? How do we want to shape this neighbourhood and our life within it? Through being open, even when there's nothing going on, it's a place of availability where people can just be and bump into each other and have those informal conversations that are often just God moments when people can bump into each other. So we're wondering if, in a place like St. Peter's, actually those 7 sacred spaces can be expressed in a church at the heart of a neighbourhood. And even in somewhere like St. James, it doesn't have the same architecture, whether the values that are represented there can be expressed in our life as Christians, whether it's not just on a Sunday, but also through the rest of the week. If it's learning, what have I learned about God today? Where have I been available to other people? How am I showing hospitality? Am I doing good work And is that serving people? How am I taking responsibility and making decisions about my own life, the life of my family, of my street, of my community, to help things move forward and develop? Do I have a pattern of personal prayer and reflection? And am I joining regularly with God's people for worship? Those 7 questions are each based on the 7 sacred spaces, and they're all great daily discipleship questions that we could mull over. So we're exploring those 7 sacred spaces over the next few weeks, and each week we'll look at one in particular and how we might live it, how we might see it in our individual lives and in the life of the church, and how maybe that vision expressed in the way that the ancient monasteries were constructed, maybe that vision is also a vision for the way that we live our life as Christians at the heart of our neighbourhoods today.